This is not a table quiz, so I'll give you the answers at the outset to what may seem a fairly long list. Isabella Todd, Liberal Unionist, advocate of education for women. Marianne McCracken, abolitionist, social reformer and activist for the rights of women. James Hewitt, poet, political activist. Morris Leach, Whitbread Prize-winning novelist, dramatist and radio producer. Stuart Parker, working-class Protestant background, lecturer and playwright. Louis MacNeice, son of a Church of Ireland cleric, poet, dramatist. Presbyterianism, an influential religious denomination, influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment and embedded a radical tradition into historical Ulster. Thomas Carnduff, shipyard poet, Orangeman and playwright. The Weaver poets, worked in the linen industry, wrote poems mainly in Ulster Scots. Francis Hutcheson, born in Saintfield, Scottish Presbyterian family, influential philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment. Ruby Murray, born in Belfast, one of the most popular singers in the British Isles in the 1950s, with numerous hit records, 5 in the top 20 of the time in a single week. Gary Lightbody and Van Morrison, need I say more? Ulster Scots and Anglo-Irish, the heritage and traditions of places, surnames, language and commerce in Northern Ireland. Gaelic, part of the culture and heritage, music, dance, surnames, place names, contributes to the rich and diverse mosaic of life in Northern Ireland. Many Protestant Gaelic speakers came from Scotland. Sir Dennis Henry, MP, son of a prosperous Catholic businessman, a Unionist MP, First Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland. Sam Thompson, working class playwright whose play Across the Bridge challenged sectarianism and social injustice in Northern Ireland. James Ellis, well-known television actor, played in the iconic Billy plays by Graham Reed from a Protestant working class background, wrote the screenplay for You, Me and Marley. Montgomery Hyde, Unionist MP, served as a UK delegate to the Council of Europe Consultative Assembly in Strasbourg, the most vocal MP of the period on the subject of homosexual law reform. Solace Highland dancers, based in Brady, rapidly emerging as mold breakers in the field of community and cross-community cultural outreach and education. John Gorman, Unionist politician, Catholic businessman, awarded the Military Cross, senior RUC officer. The danger in presenting a list like this, which is already long, but by no means exhaustive, is that you risk becoming a hostage to fortune and will be questioned, why did you not mention James Galway, the two Rorys, George Best? I could go on. In the modern day, Chelsea Pascoe, a young Belfast-based female musician and teacher who writes music for choirs, brass bands. Dawn Purvis, social activist. Joanne Dobson, campaigner for organ donation. Tony Macaulay, Shankill-born broadcaster, filmmaker and writer, and not forgetting his daughter Hope, an up-and-coming fashion designer. Rosemary Jenkinson, fiction writer and playwright who describes her upbringing as culturally British, and in a statement which ought to alarm unionism, suggests that in her experience, a shipyard hammer was revered more than a pen. And Linda Irvine, advocate for Gaelic language. All of this is without mentioning those who've left their homes in the past and more recently to make contributions in science, military, law, medicine, politics, business and the arts. The Linen Hall Library, with its rich catalogue of materials on the theatre and performing arts. Choirs, drama clubs, musical societies, numerous talented musicians and bands who play the music traditional to their communities and more. Not a banner, bonfire, siege or Somme in sight. Not that these are unworthy of mention. So a question to ask and address: why does Unionist settler culture, its traditions and heritage, attract ridicule and get dismissed so readily as having few redeeming graces? We do not have to look far for answers. When talks which led to the Good Friday Agreement were ongoing, the now defunct Andersontown News described Ulster Scots as a DIY language for orange men, or words to that effect. An early version of cancel culture, perhaps. In a mismatch with their linguistic and cultural heritage, many who identify as Unionist, perhaps due to a bout of cultural cringe, internalised and accommodated the mockery typical of Unionist stereotyping as unimaginative, inward-looking, unenlightened, misguided, and not much crack. In regard to linguistics, it was an historically inaccurate comment which presents as an uncharitable attempt to demonise and dehumanise. It betrays little understanding of those stigmatised as the least fashionable community in Western Europe. Clearly, the writer had not been exposed to the poetry of 19th century weaver poet Thomas Beggs. The remarks in the paper seem not dissimilar in nature and tone to that of Sammy Wilson, DUP MP, in describing the GAA as the sporting wing of the IRA. Such political comments display a purpose of enhancing your own cultural preference by seeking to diminish or ridicule another, and embed culture in the arena of combative binary identities wherein politicians want to act as curators of heritage, traditions, and broader culture. They also portray a need to establish narrow boundaries, behind which symbolism promotes an orthodoxy, nurtured and sealed through exclusivity, essentialism, and selection, not least in regard to memory and commemoration. It bears the hallmarks of strident cultural supremacy, some might say chauvinism, and allows an appreciation of shared culture to slip away. The motivation is political, and the purpose strategic in aiming to mould compliant identity branding to gain power. A series of tactical decisions are made to promote political interplay alongside a cultural mantra. The effect is to produce reductionist cultural understanding and frame it to serve a desired narrative bordering on myth-making, to be soaked up like a communal sponge. A filtered claim on cultural belonging results. In the case of modern Irish republicanism, much of Gaelic cultural expression is deployed to advance a political cause. When writer, former prisoner and Sinn Féin spokesperson Danny Morrison states that art and culture can displace conflict contingent with political activity and opportunity, he is fine-tuning a traditional model as opposed to root, where music, plays, books, language, concerts and festivals can energise a political edge. Unionist leaders are not averse to pursuing and extracting the soft power of culture and aligning their politics to favoured institutional affiliations and past events. Hence, parades and self-preserving but increasingly marginalised rituals when viewed from a secular and multicultural stance. Since this cultural expression is linked to politics, then the same perceptions transfer to political unionism. You cannot have your orange and eat it. With unionists or pro-union individuals in increasing numbers distancing from this sphere of unquestioning cultural expectation to no longer exhibit or embrace the binary, culturally essentialist paradigm, it is debatable the extent it was ever thus. It becomes clear that cultural unionism exists on and is the inheritor of a broader and diverse spectrum of cultural hybridity. There is fluidity and a variety of labels within the pro-union constituency, providing confirmation that unionism is not an homogeneous cultural grouping. Rather, is it one which includes loyalist, Protestant, Catholic, BME, civic, cultural, British, liberal, conservative, atheist, Presbyterian, Anglican, and more, all of which are intertwined to varying degrees. Some will identify as Irish, British, Northern Irish, or if they wish to affirm their heritage, Gaelic, Ulster Scots, or Anglo-Irish. Other more recently arrived ethnicities in Northern Ireland also vote pro-union. In the cultural sporting arenas, allegiances and resulting relationships are equally flexible. We have Irish cricket, Irish rugby, Irish hockey, Ulster rugby, Northern Ireland football team, and Great Britain and Northern Ireland when it comes to the Olympic Games. These pluralist characteristics of unionist sporting involvement, set alongside social and religious diversity, are not a neat fit with the singular cultural imagination which too authoritative and patently uninformed politics have attempted to foster. Historically, present-day unionist culture, the heritage of which predates planter settlement and the Act of Union, and therefore the political unionism established to oppose Home Rule, is dynamic and always being formed, with linguistic, literary, musical connections to and patterned relationships with major regions of Great Britain and Ireland. It has inter- and intrawoven features not always acknowledged. This is the settler culture pedigree of modern unionism, and in a global world of travel and easy connectivity, change and cross-fertilisation becomes even more expansive and instantaneous. This is deeper significance when matched to an understanding of how and what we mean by culture has expanded. During the recent Fringe Festival hosted by the Northwest Cultural Partnership, one of the presentations addressed the question, what is culture? In entertaining and interactive style, the presenter explains that culture includes art, music, literature, language, sports, and dance. With reference to local individuals and events, the viewer is able to appreciate the contribution culture makes to communities. It follows that if a community is pluralist and diverse, then culture will mirror this and allow scope for sharing fluidity and hybridity. If unionism is comprised of individuals and groups with diverse heritage, values and involvement, subject to change over time in, for example, music, literature and sports, all contributing to the mosaic of modern British culture, how can it be otherwise? The term culture is derived from Latin and relates to a dynamic process. Such is the nature of culture today, and pro-union individuals are at one with this. In earlier times, culture was seen through a very elitist lens with limited connection to the wider community. Historically, this contrasted with low or popular culture, less classical literature and music and more to do with periodicals, newspapers, pop music and show business. A modern illustration portrays this view as limiting, not democratic or inclusive. Is it the case with unionism that too much is below the surface? In the mid-20th century, as society began to challenge the absence of different voices and content, women, ethnic artists, sexual minorities and the working class, the idea of culture became wider and more inclusive. Feminists began to highlight the work of female writers. The emergence of the kitchen sink dramatist was a landmark in British theatre. Collectively, a range of creativity facilitated recognition of different categories, so that we now enjoy a diverse cultural environment of, for example, gay, feminist, Asian, British, and working class literature, as well as different styles of music and dance. They have always existed to some extent, but not recognized as such. Culture then encompasses the arts, customs, lifestyles, beliefs, values, behaviour, knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. This view of culture is more democratic and comprehensive and rightfully recognises greater complexity than earlier definitions. Almost anything we do as human beings in society is related to culture. It is through this prism that we should encourage a fuller and more meaningful understanding of the interlocking contemporary mosaic of settler and unionist cultural expression. It is not a stagnant, one-dimensional identity or culture. And yet Northern Ireland, particularly unionism, is judged otherwise and therefore not in line with mainland Britain or the modern world. Why is such a claim seen as valid? Has no surrender unionism betrayed the totality of its cultural DNA to concentrate on and comply with a minimalist identity to counter Irish nationalism? With the growth of nationalisms in the 19th century and the formation of separate nation states in Europe and elsewhere, each nation state was deemed in need of its own national cultural and literary canon. Irish nationalists embraced this concept in the Gaelic revival to counter Anglo-Irish culture. This was pursued energetically following the establishment of the Irish Free State and constitutional changes in the 1930s. It is understandable, when Northern Ireland was established as one of two states on the island of Ireland, that unionism, facing opposition from militant republicanism and unsure of support from Westminster, felt vulnerable and sought to establish solidarity through a distinctive political and cultural identity. However, in only embracing elements of an imperial past, sacrifice, resistance, and heroism, unionism valued certain events, icons, history, commemorations, and the arts to the exclusion of others. Gaelic language and history, for example, which had been an interest of those who now identified as unionist, was disavowed and discouraged. A selective orthodoxy emerged, and as with political unionism, diversity or radical departure was discouraged. The mantra of united we stand, divided we fall, and the insecurity this reflected seemed to permeate all aspects of life, to suffocate and discourage any radical political, social, intellectual, or cultural challenge or deviation. In a conversation for another occasion, it would be worth considering that this resulted in a lack of democratic and political quality assurance. The view of academic writer Conal Parry regarding unionist monolithic imagery should not be ignored. Protestant working class heritage and culture, he contends, was downplayed. That image of a reactionary unionist monolith was allowed to emerge. Yet, unionist culture breathed, and with growing access to secondary education, creativity survived. Conal cites, amongst others, the works of Christina Reid, who is referenced in an Irish Times interview as using her dramas to negotiate the Troubles and beyond with humour that aid survival. The works of Gary Mitchell and Ron Hutchison, amongst others, are also addressed. In a digital age, there's opportunity to take the celebration and sharing of this culture to a new level. Sharing is not new. We live in a shared space whose history, heritage, and influences have been and continue to be shaped by variation and experiences reflected to a greater or lesser extent in how we speak, family names and street names, architecture, worship, values, and not least, songs, literature, and dance. Unionist heritage, Scottish Gaelic, Scots, and Anglo-Ulster have been a contributing factor of no little consequence. Visit the north coast of Antrim and you will see Scotland just 13 miles to the east. Different phases of continuous linkage have been regular across the centuries. Scottish roots sown by Scottish Gaelic and Scots-speaking people, some of whom may have been returning to their Celtic ancestral homeland, go deep and are interwoven with Irish Gaelic and Anglo-Ulster culture. Over time, interaction and engagement has been both inter and intracommunal. In her book, A Twisted Root, writer Patricia Craig, from a nationalist Republican background, traces her family history to show multi-layered family changes in religion, relationships, and political allegiance in County Armagh. It is not exceptional to that area. We should not be lazy or dismissive in acknowledging this. It is part of the linguistic and cultural environment we share. You cannot avoid it any more than those from a mainly Ulster Scots background can avoid the Anglo and Gaelic influences which define this city of Derry and region on both sides of the border. When it arrived here, Anglo and Ulster Scots culture did not come into an empty location, but interacted with a cultural environment characterised by other culture, customs, traditions and beliefs, bringing change not always welcomed, but that change was a two-way process. It is apparent in the surnames of families. Examples are easily provided. Hume is a surname that has a very specific origin, derived from Hume Castle in Berwickshire in the Scottish border region, where the family were wardens of the Eastern March in the medieval period. That is, guardians of the eastern end of the border between England and Scotland. The name is still associated with Clan Hume today, and they still maintain a family seat in the borders. Likewise, Anderson is quite clearly a Scottish surname, deriving from the 14th century name Fitzandrew. The name is common due to the popularity of the name Andrew after Scotland's patron saint. The political and cultural preferences of both of these figures are well known and a matter of personal choice. But judging by surnames, it is clear that Ulster Scots, to some extent, forms a part of the web that is their individual identity. In this part of the world, such is unlikely to be one-dimensional. Check your DNA. In the case of Ulster Scots, individuals could be Anglican, Catholic, or Presbyterian. The latter two of these denominations shared victimhood under the penal laws. In addition to surnames, there is the language you speak. Perhaps unknowingly, individuals apply the Ulster Scots linguistic culture of the region. Do these words sound familiar? Have a look. The roots of Londonderry English lie in the interaction between three linguistic elements: the English of Derry's early English settlers, the much larger influx of Scots-speaking Scottish settlers, the influence of both the Irish Gaelic indigenous of the Foyle Valley, and with the increase of movement from parts of Donegal and Tyrone, these areas distinct dialects of Irish. Also, of course, education. This is the linguistic cultural heritage shared by Unionists who reside here. Cecil Francis Alexander, for example, the hymn writer, wrote both in Standard English and Ulster Scots. There are other aspects evidenced in the built environment and commercial contribution of individuals and families. Churches and architecture. Sadly, for a variety of reasons, we've lost much of our historical built environment, but enough has survived to inform awareness of settler Ulster Unionist contribution to our shared culture. Enterprise and commerce. A pioneering merchant class drove commercial growth. Members of this community included the McCorkle family, as well as the founder of Tilley and Henderson and Hoggs, who were also involved in the shirt industry. The Watts of Watts Distillery, as well as the Stewarts of Pennyburn, who founded Derry's first whisky distillery in 1815. Trade and immigration. I've mentioned the family of McCorkle. They spring from a Dalriadan clan, McCorkadale, in Argyllshire in western Scotland. The name is derived from Gaelic. The Baron was the clan chief. They would have been Catholic. When we look at place names and street names, we have many Braes and Burns, Glasgow Terrace, Montrose and Melrose, amongst many others, which indicate the culture and heritage which shaped the area. We can see from the map where they've come from. In addition, there are many versions of anglicised Gaelic names. You will have little trouble in recognising the small selection which is indicative of the unifying and hybrid nature of cultural heritage, not least settler Unionist. Rossdowney, Altnagelvin, Cluny, Kilfennan. Culture by its nature is not a paint-by-numbers picture and can change. These examples, whilst local, are typical of others to be found in Enniskillen, Antrim, Ballymena, Belfast, Omagh, Coleraine, and many other urban and rural locations, including Donegal, Monaghan, and Cavan. Much has been written about Unionist politics and the interplay with Unionist culture, which many see as identifiable only in orange banners, bonfires, the siege, and the Somme. These, correctly managed, and the efforts in this city in producing the Maiden City Accord needs to be applauded, will and should rightly remain significant and valued socially and culturally. But they do not in themselves complete the cultural narrative. A negative feature of political unionism since the establishment of Northern Ireland has been the way in which it has locked itself into narrow cultural terrain that is both defensive and closed. It can be single-minded in its advocacy of the Union, but narrow-mindedness is a much less worthy trait. And this is not reflective of all Unionists. Israeli writer Guy Biner, in his book Forgetful Remembrance, comments on the ability some communities display in selecting aspects of their cultural heritage and history which they opt not to remember, and argues convincingly that unionism has largely erased from its narrative the fact that many who might now identify as unionist or pro-union had ancestors who were members of the United Irishmen and active in the battles of Antrim and Ballynahinch. He could also have included those Presbyterians whose life chances were limited by privileges afforded to Anglicans, those Protestants who were in favour of Home Rule or declined to sign the Covenant, the Ulster Covenant that is, those who married across a contentious religious divide, those who shared an interest in Gaelic language and literature, or those feeling that their working class views were denied a platform expressed their thoughts in verse or prose. There's no such thing as a cultural Lundy. Diversity is unlikely to contaminate some socially constructed purist culture. It can only enrich. Does a marching band that participates in a failure, Highland dancers performing to modern music and mixing with other traditional dancers, or a loyalist band playing with Indian musicians, does this diminish cultural roots or political convictions? Rather, this is a good direction to follow and is only positive. Unionist culture is a settler culture, and as such can embrace its shared and intermingled Irish, Anglo-Irish and Ulster Scots heritage. Culture is not the same as identity, and the hybridity that shapes and enriches life in Northern Ireland offers no threat to individual and collective national allegiances. Indeed, the opposite can be true. Opting for a narrow, politically defined and binary culture designed and manufactured to deliver power and entrench base support serves only to ensure that culture acts as a constraint on reconciliation and reinforces prejudiced views. New decade, new approach, and its planning for cultural recognition has slipped onto the COVID-19 radar. When it is revisited, it is to be hoped that those advocates for consideration of what is seen as Unionist and therefore British culture will ensure it is recognised as a tapestry of creativity, hybridity, diversity and inclusivity, that they will move beyond partisan denial strategies of the past. Many within political unionism admire Winston Churchill, not always their warmest of friends. Perhaps these final words on this occasion offer food for thought to those with an interest in and responsibility for promoting unionist settler culture in a rapidly changing world. To settle for an illusory path which courts mediocrity would be inexcusable. Culture is best lived for what it is and not for what it is perceived to be against.